We've been told that the idea for getting the perfect exposure in photography is all built off of a triangle, kind of a rigid framework of your shutter, your aperture, and your ISO working together to bring about the proper exposure. Seems like everybody has been taught this way since the beginning of photography, but it never really sat right with me. So I've been doing some thinking, and I've come up with a way of reimagining the way we think of exposure. It's not this triangle of things working together. It's much more about balance. What if we thought about it as weights, where we have to balance our shutter speed, our aperture, and our ISO to get the perfect balance of exposure. Every choice we make shifts this balance. A faster shutter speed steals light but freezes motion. A wide aperture welcomes the brightness but sacrifices depth. An ISO can lift the exposure, but it may introduce some unwanted noise. Photography isn't about chasing the right settings, it's about understanding the give and take between the settings, how to find that right balance. So today we're going to reimagine how we think about exposure from this triangle to something that just kind of makes more sense. Balance. Now, how we're to understand how these blocks work is if I add one block, say of our ISO there, that means I'm only getting one stop of light from ISO. So this represents ISO 100, where if I added all of them, that would be ISO 1600. When it comes to the shutter speed, if I add just one block there, that represents 1/2000th of a second, because I'm not getting very much light from this one. If I added up all of these green blocks, that would represent 125th of a second, so a lot more light is being gathered. Similar idea with the aperture. If I just put one block in, that represents f8, so a fairly closed down aperture, where if I put all of them in, that represents f2.8, so I'm getting a lot of light, a lot of weight from the aperture. So for this first skiing photo, you can see that the balance isn't quite right, is it? Because there's all of this motion blur. So for this exposure, I got one bit of light from our ISO. That is because I was shooting at ISO 100, and I got one bit of light from our aperture. That's because I was shooting stop down at f8. That means I have to get all of our light from our shutter speed. So can we do it with 2/1000th of a second? No. Can we do it with 1/1000th of a second? Still not balanced. 500th of a second? It's a little better. 2/50th of a second? And there we go. So I was able to get this exposure with a 2/50th of a second, but that doesn't really capture the motion very well, as you can see how it's all blurry here. So how can we rearrange our balance to really get the best exposure? Well, let's take our light out, and because it is such a nice day, it is fine to shoot at ISO 100, but let's help ourselves out just a little bit by shooting at ISO 200. Now let's add our aperture, so we can shoot at f8, and that's pretty out of balance. We can shoot at f5.6, or we can shoot at f4. Now we're getting a lot more light from our aperture. Now let's see what we can do with our shutter speed. Remember, this is a 2/1000th of a second shutter speed, and we come into balance. So this is how we can rework our aperture, ISO, and shutter speed to get a proper exposure. Now, we don't always want to be shooting at a 2/1000th of a second. Sometimes we want to prioritize our aperture. If we're going for a really narrow or a really broad depth of field, we can set that by our aperture and then compensate to balance everything out with our other settings. Now let's take a look at our next example. This is when we went to this pond to play some hockey. Now it was during the day, but it was a little bit overcast, so it wasn't quite as nice and sunny as those skiing photos. So I'm going to take out this little weight and add this little bit heavier weight to represent a bit of a darker scene. Now in this situation, I wanted to freeze the action and really highlight the people who were playing. So I can add all of my aperture weight. So that represents shooting at f2.8. I know I wanted to freeze that action, so I'm only going to shoot at 2/1000th of a second. And now I have to make up the rest of this with my ISO. So I'm going to shoot at 100, 200, 400, and there we go. A nice balanced exposure. Now, we did really enjoy playing out there at night, even to the point where the lights started to come on. Now, when the lights came on, that represents it getting darker. So we're out of balance again. What do I need to do? Well, I wanted to freeze the action, so I don't want to add too much exposure for my shutter speed. And I'm already shooting at my wide open aperture. That means the only other option I have is to add exposure from my ISO. So I can go up to shooting at 800. Didn't quite balance it. Let's go to 1600. And now we have a nice balanced exposure. And there is the thought that adding too much of our exposure from our ISO can introduce a lot of grain and noise. And that is technically true, but it still is the best way of getting the proper exposure. Because if I took out 2 stops from our ISO, I would have to shoot at 1,000th of a second, a 500th of a second. And you can see this little guy's winding up to take a slap shot. At a 500th of a second, that stick would be blurred and it wouldn't capture the proper exposure. So do not be afraid of adding your ISO, especially with modern cameras. It is the best way of capturing freezing motion in low light situations. Now, there are some times when we're shooting in really dark situations, so I'm gonna add all of the weight on this side. Now, our camera is capable of doing some pretty amazing things when it comes to gathering light. So when the situation calls for it, we can get out our tripod, we can open up our aperture, and we can use our highest setting for ISO, and we can still balance even the darkest situations. This really comes into play when we're looking at things like astrophotography. When we just have the light of the stars to work with, we really need to find the right balance still, because if we take too dark of a photo and try to brighten it on the computer, it just will fall apart, especially when we're already shooting at high ISOs. So to find this proper exposure, there's a tool that we can look for, and that is our histogram. It's really important, especially at night, to rely on your histogram, because just our LCD screens can look too bright, especially once our eyes have already adjusted to the darkness of night. Our LCD can show us an underexposed photo that still looks pretty nice, and then we get it back onto our computer, look at it during the daylight, and we wonder what we were thinking out there. So use your histogram, especially at night. We want to make sure that the main peak of the exposure has come off of the right side and is somewhere in the center or even slightly to the left of the histogram, and this will give us the best possible exposure. When we're shooting at night, there is that time limit of how long we can shoot. We can't shoot for 3 or 4 minutes unless we want the stars to blur. Remember, we're still freezing action even when we have our tripod, and we can't open up our aperture any wider than the widest setting of our lens. For many of us, that's f2.8, maybe f1.8, or somewhere in the f1s, but still that's set. We can't open it up anymore. So we really have to add our exposure from our ISO. Remember, the most important thing isn't being afraid of noise and not using our ISO, it's getting a balanced exposure. So do not be afraid to do whatever it takes to balance out your exposure at night, even if it means shooting at ISO 6400 or even higher. So I think this is starting to make sense, but let's look at one more example before we wrap things up. In this example, we're going to see how I played with my aperture to get the desired effect for a wedding I was photographing. Now, this bridal portrait here was shot during the day with plenty of sunshine, so it's not too heavy of an exposure. In this first image, I really wanted to isolate the bride. I didn't want any detail coming from the background. So I zoomed in on my 70-200, opened my aperture all the way up to f2.8, shot at my fastest shutter speed and with my lowest ISO. And that brought me a nice balanced exposure. But I was thinking while I was in the moment that I didn't want to shoot everything wide open. I didn't want to just completely isolate the bride in every single photo. I wanted to give the bride and groom some variety in the images. And one of the reasons they chose this location for their portraits is these beautiful aspen trees that's behind her. So I knew I wanted to give them some that shows a little bit of detail in those aspens. So instead of shooting wide open at f2.8, or even at f4, I decided to shoot at f5.6. Now, if I left my settings the same, my exposure would be out of balance. It would be way too dark because I took 2 stops of light away. Now, I know that this isn't exactly a fast-moving subject, but I wanted to make sure my shutter speed stayed high enough so that there wouldn't be any motion blur from her moving or from me shaking or anything like that. So I only wanted to go down to 1/1000th of a second. We're still out of balance here, but thankfully I can add a stop for my ISO, go from 100 to 200, and now we have a properly balanced exposure. This is how you can use this idea of balance, and you can use things like your light meter in your camera or your histogram to make sure your exposure is right where it needs to be, and you can have full creative control over exactly what you want to happen. Say for this bridal portrait, I wanted to have a little bit of motion blur, perhaps her hair blowing in the wind, and I wanted to have it all from our shutter speed. Well, I can take out my aperture, I can take out my ISO, and maybe not all the way down on my shutter speed. I would be shooting at 2/50th of a second. That might show a little bit of creative motion blur. This is the exposure, the balance, the math that you need to have in your head so when you're in the moment, you can take full creative control over your camera and produce the exact images that you're hoping to make. So I hope this has been helpful. I hope it made sense that we can get away from thinking of the exposure triangle and think about building our exposure with balance. Now it's time for me to beg for thumbs ups if you've enjoyed this video. If this is your first time watching one of my videos, please hit subscribe. I'm going to do my best to be more regular in posting, and I want to do more kind of creative, educational, basic content like this. So let me know what you guys thought in the comments, if this made sense, if it was totally off base, or what you guys want to see more of in the future. Again, my name is Alex McGregor, and I thank you so much for watching.